What would drive a trusted leader of faith, a man revered by his congregation, adored by his family, to cross a line so devastating it would shake an entire community? How does a life built on devotion, respect, and moral authority descend into chaos and tragedy? These are the questions that haunt the quiet streets of a town still reeling from an unspeakable crime. At 7:30 p.m. on an otherwise unremarkable evening, a disturbing scene emerged in a forgotten corner of the city. The body of a young woman was found in an abandoned garage, her life stolen in a moment of unthinkable violence. The first responders described the area as cold, barren, and unsettlingly quiet, as if the shadows themselves held the weight of what had occurred. The woman's identity, as well as the circumstances of her death, would ignite a storm of questions. But it wasn't just the brutality of the act that shocked the town, it was the revelation of who was involved. The whispers began almost immediately. How could this happen? Who was capable of such an act? And why was the name of the beloved pastor Ezekiel Johnson suddenly on everyone's lips? This is the story of secrets hidden behind a pulpit, a forbidden relationship, and a series of choices that led to heartbreak, betrayal, and murder. But as the investigation unfolds, one thing becomes clear: the truth is never as simple as it seems. What really happened that night? And how did it come to this? The answers lie ahead, waiting to be uncovered. If you're captivated by true stories that reveal the unexpected depths of human nature, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest uploads. Dive with us into the mysteries, the heartbreaks, and the gripping tales that remind us how fragile trust can be. Join us as we uncover stories that linger long after they're told. Let's begin. Welcome to True Crime Archives. Thank you to all our viewers, especially our amazing subscribers, for your continued support. Your encouragement drives us to keep improving and delivering the most compelling daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Stay tuned, there's so much more to uncover. For over 15 years, Pastor Ezekiel Johnson stood as a beacon of faith and guidance in the community of Silver Ridge. His name carried weight, not because of wealth or status, but because of the trust he had earned from his congregation and the values he appeared to uphold. Ezekiel wasn't just a preacher, he was a counselor, a mentor, and a source of solace for those in need. Whether officiating weddings, delivering sermons that left the church pews alive with amens, or visiting the sick late into the night, he was seen as the embodiment of selflessness and moral authority. But beneath the polished exterior of his ministry, Ezekiel was a man struggling to keep his world intact. His family was at the heart of his reputation. Miranda Johnson, his wife of 18 years, was as devoted to the church as her husband. Together, they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, whose laughter often echoed through the halls of the church during Sunday services. To the outside world, they were the perfect family, united by faith and love. But perfection, as we all know, is rarely what it seems. Miranda was more than a pastor's wife, she was the backbone of Ezekiel's ministry. She managed church events, counseled members of the congregation, organized charity drives, and somehow balanced these roles with her job as a nurse at the local hospital. Her days were packed from sunrise to sunset, leaving little time for herself and even less for her marriage. At first, Ezekiel tried to be understanding. He knew the demands placed on Miranda were enormous, but as time wore on, he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. Their conversations became brief and transactional, discussions about the children's school schedules or the logistics of the next church event. The intimacy they once shared had faded into the background, lost amid the noise of responsibilities. Ezekiel felt trapped in a role he could no longer fulfill with the same fervor. As he stood in the pulpit each Sunday, delivering sermons about love, patience, and forgiveness, he began to feel like an imposter. Depression crept in, its weight pressing harder with each passing day. He questioned everything: his ability to lead, his worth as a husband, and even his faith. For a man who had spent his life preaching about the strength found in trusting God, Ezekiel found himself in a crisis of belief. How could he guide others when he felt so lost himself? How could he mend the cracks in his own home when he was too exhausted to even acknowledge them? Miranda, too, was struggling, though her battle was different. The demands of her dual roles as a caregiver at work and a cornerstone of the church left her physically drained and emotionally depleted. She felt invisible in her own home, her efforts unnoticed and unappreciated. What Ezekiel saw as emotional distance, Miranda saw as survival. She was holding everything together, or at least trying to, but the strain was beginning to show. Their children noticed the shifts as well. Dinner table conversations became quieter, filled with long silences punctuated by half-hearted smiles. The warmth that once defined their household had given way to a kind of polite detachment. For Ezekiel, the weight of his personal struggles bled into his professional life. Parishioners began to notice subtle changes. His sermons, once vibrant and full of passion, seemed less inspired. His energy during community events was subdued, his smile no longer reaching his eyes. The congregation whispered about their pastor, but only out of concern. After all, even the most devoted among them believed that Ezekiel was human, capable of struggle, but surely never capable of the unthinkable. It was during this period of turmoil that Ezekiel's life took an unexpected turn. A chance encounter, one that seemed innocuous at first, would set in motion events that neither he nor the town of Silver Ridge could have foreseen. As Ezekiel wrestled with the crumbling foundation of his life, he made a choice that would not only shatter his reputation but also leave a trail of destruction in its wake. The question now wasn't whether Ezekiel could salvage the pieces of his life. The question was how far he would go to keep them from falling apart altogether. Her name was Celine Carter, though the world knew her first as Samuel. Born into a devout and deeply conservative African-American household, Celine's early life was marked by a constant battle to be seen and understood. Growing up in the small town of Edgewater, Samuel was the youngest of 3 children, and expectations weighed heavily on him. His father, a deacon in their local church, was a firm believer in traditional values, while his mother balanced warmth with a sharp adherence to the moral codes of their faith. Sundays were a ritual: pressed suits, polished shoes, and the unyielding sermons of their pastor. The Carter family prided themselves on being a pillar of their community. But Samuel was different. From a young age, he felt out of place in his own skin, a feeling he couldn't put into words. The expectations his family had for him, to be strong, masculine, a leader, felt like a cage. As he grew older, that unease solidified into a painful clarity: Samuel wasn't who the world thought he was. By his teenage years, the tension in the Carter household was palpable. Samuel's increasing discomfort with traditional gender roles led to arguments that often ended with silence at the dinner table. His father dismissed his feelings as a phase, while his mother prayed fervently for clarity and direction. At church, Samuel felt the weight of every gaze, every hushed whisper. High school became both a sanctuary and a battlefield. While he faced bullying and isolation from some peers, he also found small moments of joy in expressing himself, wearing brighter colors, experimenting with hairstyles, and exploring the parts of his identity he couldn't show at home. But the defining moment came during a heated argument with his father at the age of 18. After months of tension, Samuel finally spoke the words he had been holding back: "I'm not who you think I am. I'm not your son. I'm Celine." The declaration was met with disbelief, anger, and ultimately rejection. That night, Celine packed a bag and left the only home she had ever known, stepping into a world that would prove to be as cruel as it was liberating. Celine's journey to embrace her identity was anything but smooth. Her first big moment came when she visited a support group for transgender individuals at a local community center. Nervous but determined, Celine walked into the room and was greeted by people who, for the first time, made her feel seen. It was in that space that she heard stories of others who had transitioned, who had faced their fears and stepped into the world as their authentic selves. Inspired by their courage, Celine decided to take the next step. At 20, she began hormone replacement therapy, a deeply personal milestone that filled her with both excitement and apprehension. The first few months were challenging. The physical changes were gradual at first but undeniable: the softening of her skin, the reshaping of her features, the changes in her voice and body. As her transition progressed, Celine faced both moments of triumph and heartbreak. There were days when she felt radiant, confident, and unstoppable, and others when the stares and whispered judgments of strangers made her question everything. She lost friendships, faced discrimination, and encountered countless barriers, but she also found unexpected allies, people who celebrated her bravery and offered support when she needed it most. By the time Celine was 22, her physical transition was in full swing, but the emotional and social aspects were ongoing battles. She legally changed her name to Celine Carter, a choice that felt both symbolic and empowering. She chose the name Celine because it evoked a sense of beauty and strength, a reminder of the person she had fought so hard to become. Celine's transition wasn't just about her appearance, it was about reclaiming her identity, her dignity, and her right to exist on her own terms. It was a journey marked by courage, pain, and a fierce determination to be true to herself. Through her transition, Celine learned to navigate a world that often refused to acknowledge her authenticity. She faced rejection from potential employers, prejudice in social settings, and even danger in moments when her identity was questioned. Yet, despite everything, she held on to her sense of self with remarkable resilience. Her work as a sex worker was not a dream or a goal but a means of survival in a society that offered her few other opportunities. Still, it allowed her to maintain her independence and, in some ways, gave her a chance to connect with others, even if those connections were fleeting. It was in this line of work that Celine met Nia Freeman, a fellow sex worker who quickly became her closest confidant. Nia was everything Celine needed: a friend who didn't judge, who listened without offering empty platitudes, and who understood the struggles of navigating a world that often felt hostile. Nia had her own stories, her own battles, but she made space for Celine. The two often joked about the absurdity of their situations, finding laughter in the darkest corners of their lives. Together, they created a small, fragile bubble of safety in an otherwise unforgiving world. But even with Nia's friendship, Celine longed for something more. She wanted a life where she wasn't just surviving but thriving. She dreamed of being loved, not for what she could provide, but for who she was. In her heart, she craved a relationship where she felt valued, seen, and cherished. Her work as a sex worker offered glimpses of connection, fleeting moments of intimacy that left her feeling emptier than before. Clients came and went, each one a reminder of what she didn't have. Celine masked her loneliness with a sharp wit and an air of confidence, but Nia saw through it. "You deserve more," Nia would tell her during their late-night conversations. "You don't have to settle for crumbs." But Celine wasn't sure she believed it. She had built walls around her heart, walls fortified by years of rejection and pain. And then came Pastor Ezekiel Johnson. Their meeting was almost accidental, one of those moments that seemed inconsequential at the time but would go on to change everything. For Celine, Ezekiel represented something she had rarely encountered: a man who seemed genuinely interested in her, who listened to her stories and didn't make her feel like she was just a transaction. In Ezekiel, Celine saw a glimmer of the life she had always dreamed of. She didn't fully trust it, not at first, but the promise of something real, something lasting, was enough to draw her in. What Celine didn't know was that this relationship, born out of longing and desperation, would set off a chain of events that neither she nor Ezekiel could control. Celine Carter had fought her whole life to be seen, to be loved. But in chasing that dream, she would unknowingly step into a nightmare that would cost her everything. It started on a warm afternoon, the kind of day that seemed perfect for the church's outreach event in the bustling downtown streets of Silver Ridge. Pastor Ezekiel Johnson, ever the charismatic leader, stood among his congregation, handing out pamphlets and engaging with passers-by about faith and redemption. He was a man on a mission, or so it seemed to those who watched him. Amid the crowd, his eyes landed on Celine Carter. She was standing near the edge of the street, her sharp features softened by the afternoon sun. Celine wasn't there for the church, she had simply been passing through, but something about the scene drew her attention. Their eyes met briefly, and Ezekiel felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name: curiosity, perhaps, or a quiet recognition of his own loneliness mirrored back at him. He approached her with the same warmth he extended to everyone, but as their conversation began, the energy between them shifted. What started as a polite exchange about the church's mission turned into something deeper. Celine's guarded demeanor melted slightly under Ezekiel's attentive questions, and for the first time in a long while, she felt genuinely seen. For Ezekiel, the encounter was both unsettling and magnetic. Celine was unlike anyone he had ever met, bold yet vulnerable, confident yet carrying an undercurrent of pain he recognized all too well. Their conversation ended with a polite goodbye, but the moment lingered in Ezekiel's mind long after the event concluded. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again, first by coincidence, then by design. Ezekiel began seeking opportunities to visit the part of town where Celine spent most of her time. What he told himself were innocent check-ins became increasingly frequent, and with each meeting, their conversations grew more personal. They talked about their lives, their struggles, their unspoken wounds. Celine shared stories of her journey, her battles with rejection, and the walls she had built to protect herself. Ezekiel, in turn, spoke of his failing marriage, the pressures of his role as a pastor, and the suffocating weight of expectations that left him feeling empty. Despite the vast differences in their lives, they found common ground in their shared feelings of isolation and rejection. Celine saw in Ezekiel a man who listened without judgment, who treated her as a person rather than a label. For Ezekiel, Celine became a sanctuary, someone who didn't expect him to have all the answers or maintain the facade of perfection. Their connection deepened, and soon, what began as chance encounters turned into deliberate rendezvous. Ezekiel, careful to protect his image, arranged their meetings in places where no one would recognize him, a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, a secluded park where they could talk without fear of being seen. The more time they spent together, the harder it became for either of them to ignore the line they were crossing. Yet, the line blurred with every shared moment, every stolen glance, every conversation that felt more intimate than it should have. Their affair became a dangerous escape for both of them. For Celine, it was a chance to experience a kind of connection she had longed for but never truly known. For Ezekiel, it was a reprieve from the crushing weight of his responsibilities and the emptiness of his home life. But secrets have a way of seeping through even the most carefully constructed barriers. Ezekiel's demeanor began to change, and those closest to him started to notice. He was more distracted during sermons, his once commanding presence in the pulpit replaced by a subtle restlessness. Church meetings that he used to lead with enthusiasm became rushed affairs, and he often found excuses to leave early. Even his family sensed the shift. His wife, Miranda, noticed that he was spending more evenings away, and his children felt the growing distance between them. Among the congregation, whispers began to circulate. Ezekiel was always a private man, but now there was an air of something amiss. He seemed preoccupied, almost detached, as if his mind was elsewhere. A few church members even mentioned seeing him in parts of town that didn't align with his usual routine. But no one dared confront him directly. Ezekiel had built years of trust with his flock, and the idea of questioning him felt almost sacrilegious. Still, the unease grew, a quiet undercurrent that ran through the pews each Sunday. For Ezekiel and Celine, the walls were closing in, though neither of them fully realized it. What had started as a fleeting moment of connection had spiraled into something neither of them could control. Their affair, once a source of solace, now carried a weight of its own, one that would soon come crashing down, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The question wasn't if they would be found out, but when. And when that moment came, it would change everything. The cracks in Ezekiel Johnson's seemingly perfect life didn't appear all at once. They started small, barely noticeable to anyone but those closest to him. His wife, Miranda, was the first to sense that something was wrong. At first, she thought it was stress. Leading a congregation of hundreds wasn't easy, and she understood the immense pressure her husband faced. But over time, Ezekiel's behavior shifted in ways that couldn't be explained by work alone. He was distant, distracted, and irritable, even during the rare moments they spent as a family. Miranda, ever the dutiful wife, tried to bridge the growing gap between them. She planned quiet dinners after the children had gone to bed, suggested weekend outings, and even took on more responsibilities at the church to lighten Ezekiel's load. But no matter what she did, the warmth that once defined their marriage was nowhere to be found. The distance began to wear on Miranda, chipping away at her confidence. She found herself questioning if she was the problem. Had she taken on too much at the church, leaving Ezekiel feeling neglected? Was her role as a mother and caretaker overshadowing her role as a wife? Miranda, who had always prided herself on her strength, started to feel invisible in her own home. While Miranda wrestled with self-doubt, Ezekiel was waging a battle of his own, a battle he kept buried deep inside. His affair with Celine had started as an escape, a brief reprieve from the suffocating demands of his life. But what began as a fleeting connection had grown into a weight he couldn't shake. At the church, the strain on Ezekiel became increasingly evident. His sermons, once passionate and inspiring, began to lack their usual energy. The anecdotes and lessons he shared felt rehearsed, as though he was simply going through the motions. Parishioners who had once hung on his every word now left services feeling as though something was missing. Ezekiel's leadership also began to falter. He forgot meeting times, arrived late to events, and brushed off the concerns of church members with vague assurances that he was just tired. The congregation, though still loyal, couldn't ignore the changes in their pastor. Whispers of concern spread through the pews, but no one dared to confront him directly. The pressure was relentless. Ezekiel felt as though he was being pulled in every direction, by his wife, his children, his congregation, and now, by Celine. Each demand on his time and energy only served to deepen his sense of failure. At home, the distance between Ezekiel and Miranda grew wider. Their once lively conversations were reduced to curt exchanges about schedules and obligations. Miranda's attempts to connect were met with evasive answers or hollow reassurances. The man she had loved for nearly 2 decades felt like a stranger. For Ezekiel, guilt became a constant companion. He knew he was failing his family, his church, and himself. Late at night, when the house was silent and his thoughts were loudest, he would replay the choices that had brought him to this point. He justified his affair by telling himself that it filled a void Miranda wouldn't understand. But the justifications rang hollow, even to him. The guilt wasn't enough to stop him, though. If anything, it drove him further into desperation. He clung to Celine as a lifeline, convincing himself that their relationship was the only thing keeping him afloat. But with every secret meeting, every lie he told to cover his tracks, the walls around him closed in a little tighter. Ezekiel's internal conflict was a storm he couldn't escape. He hated the man he saw in the mirror, a man who preached integrity and righteousness while living a lie. But he couldn't bring himself to end the affair or confess the truth. The thought of losing everything, his family, his position, his reputation, was too much to bear. And so, he carried on, balancing his life on a razor's edge. At home, he avoided Miranda's probing questions and the disappointed looks of his children. At church, he forced a smile and prayed that no one would notice the cracks in his facade. With Celine, he clung to the fleeting moments of comfort she provided, even as their relationship became more complicated and dangerous. The fallout in Ezekiel's life wasn't just about the choices he had made, it was about the choices he continued to make, each one dragging him further into a web of deceit and despair. He was a man torn between the life he had built and the life he had stumbled into, and the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. But even as the pressure mounted, Ezekiel remained convinced that he could keep the pieces of his life from falling apart. What he didn't realize was that the cracks were already too deep, and the collapse was inevitable. Celine Carter's life was changing, and not for the better. She hadn't spoken to her best friend, Nia Freeman, about the affair, but the cracks in her carefully constructed facade were becoming harder to hide. Nia, ever perceptive, noticed the changes almost immediately. Celine, who was once vibrant and quick-witted, had grown distracted and distant. Her laughter seemed forced, her energy muted. She canceled their usual late-night meetups and avoided conversations about her personal life. It didn't take long for Nia to suspect something was wrong. One evening, during a rare visit to Nia's apartment, the tension finally broke. "You're keeping something from me," Nia said, leaning against the kitchen counter. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but firm. "Don't act like I don't know when you're hiding something, Celine." Celine hesitated, biting her lip. She had spent weeks dodging Nia's questions, convincing herself that she could handle this on her own. But now, with her best friend staring her down, she felt the walls closing in. "It's nothing," Celine muttered, avoiding Nia's gaze. "Don't nothing me," Nia shot back. "You've been acting weird for weeks. Canceling on me, looking like you haven't slept. What's going on?" Celine sighed, knowing she couldn't brush Nia off any longer. "I've been seeing someone," she admitted quietly. Nia's eyebrows shot up. "Seeing someone? Like, a client?" "No," Celine replied quickly. "Not a client. Someone else. Someone married." The room went silent, Nia processing what Celine had just said. When she spoke, her voice was laced with disbelief. "Married? Celine, tell me you're joking." Celine shook her head, her cheeks burning with shame. "And that's not even the worst of it, is it?" Nia continued, her voice rising. "He's a pastor, isn't he? That's why you've been so secretive." Celine didn't respond, but her silence was answer enough. Nia ran a hand through her hair, pacing the room. "A married pastor, Celine? Are you serious? You know how messy that is, right? How dangerous." "I know, okay?" Celine snapped, her voice breaking. "I know it's messy. I know it's wrong. But it's not like that." "Not like what?" Nia retorted. "Not like you're setting yourself up for heartbreak? Not like you're playing with fire? This man has a wife, Celine. A family. And he's a pastor. Do you even hear yourself?" "He said he's getting a divorce," Celine said weakly. "He promised me. He said it's just not the right time to tell his wife yet." Nia's laugh was bitter. "And you believe that? Come on, Celine. Married men always say that. They tell you what you want to hear so you'll stick around while they live their double life. You think you're the first woman he's made promises to?" Celine felt her defenses crumbling. She knew Nia was right, but admitting it was too painful. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I don't understand." Nia shot back. "Look, I'm no saint. You know that. I've made my fair share of mistakes. But this? Celine, this isn't just about you. This could ruin his life, his wife's life, his kids' lives. And it'll ruin yours too." Celine's face hardened. "I can handle it," she said. "I'm not some naive little girl. I know what I'm doing." Nia shook her head, her frustration evident. "Fine," she said, throwing up her hands. "Do what you want. But don't come crying to me when it all blows up in your face." Despite Nia's warnings, Celine couldn't let go of Ezekiel. He had promised her a future, a life where they could be together without hiding. She believed him because she needed to believe him. But what Celine didn't realize was that Ezekiel wasn't planning a future with her. He was using her to escape his crumbling marriage, a temporary reprieve from the dissatisfaction he felt at home. He had no intention of leaving his wife, no matter what he told Celine. It started with a lingering exhaustion Celine couldn't explain. Her usual energy was gone, replaced by a persistent weakness that made even simple tasks feel monumental. At first, she dismissed it, attributing her symptoms to stress or lack of sleep. But as the days turned into weeks, she knew something was wrong. Reluctantly, Celine made an appointment at a local clinic. Sitting in the sterile examination room, she felt a mix of apprehension and relief. At least she would get some answers. When the doctor returned with her test results, their expression was serious. "Celine," they began gently, "you've tested positive for HIV." The words hit her like a freight train. She barely registered the rest of the conversation, her mind spiraling as she tried to process what she had just heard. HIV positive. The diagnosis echoed in her thoughts, louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. She left the clinic in a daze, clutching the paper with her results like it was both a lifeline and a death sentence. As she walked home, her thoughts raced. How did this happen? When? Celine replayed the last few months in her mind, trying to piece together the puzzle. As a sex worker, she had always been cautious, taking every precaution to protect herself. But she also knew that her profession came with risks. Then, her thoughts turned to Ezekiel. Was he the one? Had he known? The uncertainty was unbearable. Celine felt a whirlwind of emotions: fear, anger, shame, and confusion. She couldn't be sure who had infected her, but the timing of her diagnosis raised questions she couldn't ignore. She had to tell Ezekiel. Later that evening, Celine sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. Her hands trembled as she typed out a message to Ezekiel: "We need to talk. Now." He replied quickly, asking what was wrong. Celine didn't answer, instead telling him to meet her at their usual spot. The park was quiet when Ezekiel arrived, the streetlights casting long shadows over the benches. Celine was already there, pacing nervously. "What's going on?" Ezekiel asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern. Celine turned to face him, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. "I went to the clinic today," she began, her voice trembling. "And? I'm HIV positive," she said bluntly. Ezekiel's face fell, the color draining from his skin. "What? How is that possible?" "You tell me," Celine snapped. "You're the only one I've been with outside of work. Did you know? Did you know, Ezekiel?" His shock seemed genuine, but Celine wasn't convinced. "I had no idea," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Celine took a step closer, her eyes blazing with anger. "I trusted you. You said we were in this together. That we had a future." But now, her voice broke, and she looked away, trying to compose herself. Ezekiel reached out to her, but she pulled back. "Don't," she said sharply. "I need answers, Ezekiel. And I need them now." But Ezekiel had no answers to give, only the dawning realization of the consequences they both now faced. For Celine, this was just the beginning of a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And for Ezekiel, it was a harsh reminder that secrets don't stay buried forever. Ezekiel sat in his car after leaving the park, his mind spinning in a chaotic storm of disbelief and fear. Celine's revelation echoed relentlessly in his thoughts: HIV positive. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as the weight of her words sank in. His mind raced through the implications: his reputation, his family, his church. But one thought sent chills down his spine: he had been intimate with Miranda just a few days earlier. If Celine was telling the truth, the virus could already have reached his wife, potentially devastating her health and unraveling everything he had worked so hard to maintain. Ezekiel's anger bubbled beneath the surface, directed at Celine, at himself, and at the circumstances that had spiraled so far out of control. But beyond the anger, fear took hold, a fear that if Celine exposed their affair, everything would come crashing down. His marriage, his role as a father, and his leadership at the church, all of it would be destroyed. He felt the walls closing in, and the weight of his own recklessness bore down on him. For years, he had been the rock for his congregation, the man everyone turned to for guidance. Now, he was facing the greatest crisis of his life, and there was no one to turn to but himself. The next day, Ezekiel called Celine. His voice was calm, measured, though his insides churned with desperation. "We need to talk," he said. They met at a secluded park, a place where Ezekiel often felt a strange comfort in the quiet. Celine was already there when he arrived, her expression a mixture of frustration and fear. "I've been thinking," Ezekiel began, sitting beside her on the weathered bench. "About what you told me. About us." "And?" Celine asked, her voice sharp. "I'll stand by you," Ezekiel said, his tone soft, almost soothing. "We'll get through this together. But you have to trust me. You can't tell anyone yet about the affair. I just need time to figure out the best way to handle things." Celine looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Time? That's all you ever ask for. You think I don't see what you're doing? You're stalling." "I'm not," Ezekiel said quickly, taking her hand in his. "Celine, listen to me. I care about you. But you have to understand, this isn't just about us. There's my family, my church. If this gets out now, it'll destroy everything. Please, give me time." Celine hesitated, her anger wavering. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the man who had made her feel valued in a way no one else had. But even as Ezekiel spoke, his mind was already working on a plan. He knew he wasn't going to follow through on his promises. He couldn't. Celine had become a threat, and she needed to be dealt with. A few days later, Miranda sat in a clinic exam room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had been feeling unusually tired and unwell for weeks and finally decided to seek answers. Ezekiel sat beside her, his outward calm masking the dread gnawing at him. When the doctor returned with her results, the news hit like a hammer. "You've tested positive for HIV," the doctor said gently. Miranda froze, her mind struggling to process the words. "How?" she whispered, turning to Ezekiel. Ezekiel felt his breath catch. He also did the test and it came out positive. There was no escaping the truth now, at least not all of it. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely audible. I made a mistake. It was one time. A moment of weakness." Miranda's face twisted in disbelief. "You cheated on me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "It meant nothing," Ezekiel said quickly, reaching for her hand. "I swear it's over. It was a terrible mistake, and I regret it more than anything." Miranda pulled her hand away, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her heart and her life, had betrayed her in the most intimate way. Ezekiel, desperate to control the narrative, continued to plead. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," he said. "Please, Miranda. I can't lose you." But even as he spoke, his mind remained preoccupied with Celine. Miranda's diagnosis only compounded the urgency of the situation. Celine had threatened to expose everything, and now the stakes were even higher. Miranda, though devastated, still didn't know the full extent of Ezekiel's betrayal. She believed his story about a one-time mistake, unaware that it was an ongoing affair with a trans sex worker. She didn't know about Celine's threats or the dangerous thoughts swirling in Ezekiel's mind. Ezekiel, meanwhile, was running out of time. Celine's patience was wearing thin, and her anger was growing. She had made it clear that she wouldn't stay silent forever. In his desperation, Ezekiel began to rationalize the unthinkable. He told himself that protecting his family and his church was more important than anything else. If Celine refused to back down, then he would have to find a way to ensure her silence. As the pressure mounted, Ezekiel convinced himself that he was doing what had to be done. The man who had spent his life preaching forgiveness and redemption now found himself on the brink of a choice that would shatter everything he had ever stood for. Celine's threats loomed large, and Ezekiel knew that his time was running out. Ezekiel sat alone in his study late one night, his mind consumed with one thought: Celine Carter. Her threats to expose their affair had pushed him to a breaking point, and now, with Miranda's HIV diagnosis, the stakes had escalated beyond what he could handle. He replayed every conversation with Celine in his mind, her words cutting deeper each time. Her anger, her demands: "If you don't follow through, I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." Those words echoed relentlessly, leaving Ezekiel with no room to breathe. Desperation gave way to a dark resolve. He decided he had to meet with Celine one last time, not to reconcile but to put an end to the situation altogether. Picking up his phone, Ezekiel called Celine, his voice calm but firm. "Celine," he began, "we need to talk. I've been thinking about everything, and I want to figure out a way to make this work, for both of us. Celine hesitated on the other end of the line. You've been saying that for weeks, Ezekiel. Why should I believe you this time? Because I'm ready to be honest, he replied smoothly. I'll tell you everything, but we need to meet in person. Just the two of us. No interruptions. After a pause, Celine agreed, though her tone carried a hint of skepticism. Fine. Where and when? Ezekiel suggested an abandoned garage on the outskirts of town, a place he knew would be secluded. 7:30 p.m. Be discreet, he added. Celine agreed, but something about the location left her uneasy. Before heading to the meeting, Celine couldn't shake a sense of dread. Ezekiel's sudden shift in tone felt off, and the chosen location, a dimly lit, isolated garage, did little to ease her nerves. Trusting her instincts, Celine decided to share her location with Nia. She sent a text message with her live location and a brief note, meeting Ezekiel. Something important. If you don't hear from me in an hour, call me. Nia, though confused by the cryptic message, immediately responded, Be careful, Celine. And don't let him talk you into anything stupid. Celine put her phone away, took a deep breath, and headed to the garage. The garage was cold and eerily quiet when Celine arrived. The faint sound of her heels echoed as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the shadowy space. Ezekiel was already there, standing by a rusted workbench, his posture rigid and his face unreadable. You're here, he said, his voice low and steady. Celine crossed her arms, keeping her distance. What's this about, Ezekiel? What do you want? Ezekiel took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he stared at her. I want answers, Celine. About the HIV. Celine froze, caught off guard by his tone. What about it? You gave it to me, he said bluntly, his voice laced with anger. You infected me, and now my wife is infected too. Celine's shock quickly turned to indignation. Are you serious right now? You think this is all on me? I didn't know I had it, Ezekiel. And if you'd been honest about what you were doing outside of this, maybe we wouldn't be here. Ezekiel's fists clenched at his sides. Don't turn this around on me. You lied to me, Celine. You lied, and now my entire life is falling apart because of you. Celine took a step forward, her voice rising. I lied? What about you? You're the one who promised me everything, who said we'd have a future. You used me, Ezekiel. And now you're trying to blame me for your mistakes? The tension in the room was palpable as the two stared each other down, their words cutting deeper with every exchange. You don't understand what you've done to me, Ezekiel said finally, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and despair. My wife, she'll never forgive me. My church, my family, they'll never look at me the same. That's on you, Celine shot back. Not me. I didn't force you to do anything. You made your choices, Ezekiel. Ezekiel's emotions boiled over, the weight of his fear and anger becoming too much to bear. In a flash, he lunged at Celine, his hands gripping her throat as his vision blurred with rage. Celine struggled against him, her nails clawing at his arms as she tried to break free. Ezekiel, stop, she choked out, her voice barely audible. But Ezekiel couldn't stop. His mind was consumed by the thought of everything he stood to lose, his family, his church, his reputation. Celine had become the embodiment of all his failures, and in that moment, he saw no other way to silence her. When it was over, Ezekiel stepped back, his chest heaving as he stared at Celine's lifeless body. The reality of what he had done hit him like a tidal wave, but there was no turning back now. He dragged her body to a dark corner of the garage, hiding it behind a stack of old crates. As he wiped his hands on a rag he found nearby, his mind raced with his next steps. He needed to cover his tracks, to make sure no one ever connected him to this place, to her. But for now, all he could do was leave and pray that the truth would stay buried along with Celine. As he walked away from the garage, Ezekiel didn't look back. But deep down, he knew that no matter how hard he tried to hide it, the weight of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. It was a quiet morning in Silver Ridge when Nia Freeman's growing unease turned into full-blown panic. Celine hadn't responded to her calls or texts since the previous night. Nia checked her phone again, staring at the live location Celine had sent her before the meeting with Ezekiel. The dot on the map hadn't moved. Unable to shake the sense that something was terribly wrong, Nia made the call. She explained to the authorities that her friend had gone to meet someone at an abandoned garage and hadn't been heard from since. When officers arrived at the garage, the scene was grim. The dark, musty space carried a faint metallic smell, and the air felt heavy. It didn't take long for them to find Celine's body, partially concealed behind a stack of crates. The discovery was brutal, a young woman whose life had ended violently and far too soon. News of the crime spread quickly, shocking the community. The fact that such a heinous act had occurred in their quiet town was enough to send ripples of fear and disbelief through the residents. But as details began to emerge, the shock would only deepen. The forensic team worked meticulously, combing through the scene for anything that could point to Celine's killer. The first major clue came from Celine's fingernails. Scratches on her assailant during her struggle had left DNA evidence behind. Her phone, recovered near her body, provided even more damning clues. The text exchanges between Celine and Ezekiel revealed a clear connection, and the last message, sharing her location, added weight to the suspicion. When investigators dug deeper into phone records, they found a pattern of calls and messages between Ezekiel and Celine, dating back months. The messages painted a picture of a secret relationship, one that had become increasingly volatile in its final days. DNA evidence in the phone records provided investigators with a clear lead, and Ezekiel Johnson's name rose to the top of their suspect list. When officers arrived at Ezekiel's home to bring him in for questioning, his demeanor was calm, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety. He greeted them politely, as if expecting them, and agreed to go to the station without protest. In the sterile interrogation room, Ezekiel sat across from two detectives, his hands folded tightly on the table. Pastor Johnson, one of the detectives began, "We're investigating the death of Celine Carter. Her body was discovered last night in an abandoned garage. We understand you are in contact with her." Ezekiel feigned surprise, leaning back in his chair. "Celine? That's awful. I knew her, but I haven't seen her in weeks." The detectives exchanged a glance. "Your phone records tell a different story," one of them said, sliding a folder across the table. "Texts, calls, up until the night of her death. You were the last person she messaged, Pastor." Ezekiel's composure began to crack. I was trying to help her," he stammered. "She was troubled, and she reached out to me for guidance. That's all." The detectives pressed on, presenting the DNA evidence next. "We found your DNA on Celine. She fought back, Pastor Johnson. She scratched you during the struggle." Ezekiel's calm facade crumbled entirely. He leaned forward, his hands shaking. "It's not what it looks like," he pleaded. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Then tell us what happened," the detective said firmly. Ezekiel hesitated, his mind racing for an explanation, a way out. But the weight of the evidence against him was too great, and his carefully constructed story began to unravel. She threatened to ruin me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand." The detectives listened in silence as Ezekiel's story poured out, piece by piece. But his words offered no justification for the crime he had committed. As the interrogation ended, Ezekiel sat in the cold, unyielding silence of the room, knowing that the life he had once known was over. The arrest of Pastor Ezekiel Johnson sent shockwaves through Silver Ridge. The man they had trusted, the man they had looked to for guidance and moral leadership, was now accused of a brutal murder. The congregation was left reeling, torn between disbelief and anger. Questions arose about how they had missed the signs, how someone so revered could have harbored such darkness. For Miranda, the betrayal was complete. The man she had defended, even in the face of his confession to infidelity, was now unrecognizable. She was left to pick up the pieces of her life, grappling with the enormity of the lies she had been living under. And for Nia, the loss of her best friend was a pain that words couldn't capture. She had warned Celine, tried to protect her, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. As the investigation moved toward trial, one thing was certain: the community of Silver Ridge would never be the same. The community was stunned to learn of his double life. The trusted spiritual leader who stood at the pulpit each Sunday was now at the center of a murder investigation. When news broke that both Ezekiel and his wife, Miranda, were HIV positive, the town's shock turned to fury. Congregants were horrified not only by the murder but also by the implications of Ezekiel's reckless behavior. Speculation swirled about how Ezekiel had contracted the virus, further tarnishing his once unassailable reputation. The church, once a haven of hope, became a symbol of betrayal for many. Some rallied in disbelief, praying for Ezekiel's redemption, while others openly condemned him, demanding justice for Celine Carter and for Miranda, who had been caught in the crossfire of his deceit. Church members gathered outside the courthouse in disbelief. Nia Freeman took the stand with a quiet but unshakable resolve. As Celine's closest friend, her testimony provided a window into the relationship between Celine and Ezekiel, as well as the events leading up to Celine's death. She recounted Celine's text message on the night she went to meet Ezekiel, explaining how Celine had shared her location out of fear. Nia also detailed Celine's anguish over her HIV diagnosis, her growing frustration with Ezekiel's broken promises, and the escalating tension in their relationship. "She told me she was scared," Nia said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "She trusted him, even when I told her not to. But in the end, she knew something wasn't right." The prosecution used Nia's testimony to emphasize Ezekiel's calculated actions, pointing out that Celine's fears were justified and that her death was the result of Ezekiel's attempt to silence her forever. The trial unfolded with all the intensity of a high-stakes drama. Ezekiel's defense team attempted to portray him as a man pushed to his breaking point, a husband trying to navigate a failing marriage, the pressures of his ministry, and the shock of his own HIV diagnosis. They argued that the confrontation with Celine was not premeditated but a tragic moment of emotional overwhelm. "He's a man who made a mistake," his lawyer claimed. "He was trying to protect his family, his faith, and his community." The prosecution dismantled this narrative piece by piece, presenting an overwhelming array of evidence. They highlighted Celine's text messages, Ezekiel's DNA found on her body, and the phone records linking him to her on the night of her death. The prosecution also leaned heavily into the revelation of Ezekiel's HIV-positive status, emphasizing how his reckless choices had endangered not only Celine but also Miranda. "This wasn't just about an affair," the prosecutor declared in their closing argument. "This was about a man who prioritized his own desires over the safety and well-being of everyone around him." Ezekiel took the stand, visibly shaken, and tried to express remorse. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice cracking. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I was scared of what would happen if the truth came out." But his testimony failed to garner sympathy. The prosecution countered, pointing out the deliberate steps Ezekiel had taken to cover his tracks, culminating in Celine's murder. The jury deliberated for 2 days before delivering their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. In the packed courtroom, the judge addressed Ezekiel directly before announcing the sentence. "You betrayed your family, your congregation, and the trust of this community," the judge said. "Your actions were not those of a man seeking redemption but of someone trying to escape accountability at any cost." Ezekiel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The announcement was met with a mix of relief and sorrow. Miranda sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. She had been dealt blow after blow, her husband's infidelity, her HIV diagnosis, and now, the knowledge that the man she once loved was a convicted murderer. For Nia, the verdict brought some closure but little comfort. Losing Celine had left a void that no amount of justice could fill. As Ezekiel was escorted from the courtroom, the weight of his actions hung heavy in the air. The man who had once preached about forgiveness and grace now faced the rest of his life behind bars, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. The trial may have ended, but the scars left on Silver Ridge, Miranda, and those who knew Celine would remain for years to come. The congregation of Silver Ridge Community Church was left in disarray. Their once revered pastor's betrayal shattered their trust, leaving many questioning their faith and the institution they had relied on for guidance. Attendance dwindled as members struggled to reconcile their spiritual beliefs with the reality of Ezekiel's actions. For Miranda, the road to healing was long and painful. Grappling with her HIV diagnosis and the public scandal, she focused on shielding her children from the harsh scrutiny of the community. Despite everything, she found strength in rebuilding her life, stepping out of Ezekiel's shadow and redefining her future. Celine Carter's story, though tragic, became a catalyst for difficult but necessary conversations. Her life and untimely death highlighted issues of acceptance, mental health, and the devastating consequences of secrecy. Her best friend Nia vowed to ensure that Celine's voice and struggles would not be forgotten. What drives individuals to make choices that betray their values? How much of our actions are shaped by societal pressures, and how much by our own fears and desires? The story of Ezekiel, Miranda, and Celine serves as a sobering reminder of the thin line between appearances and reality. What lies beneath the surface often remains hidden until it's too late. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content.